In the shadow of World War II's conclusion, while much of Europe celebrated liberation, the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania faced a grim reality. As Nazi forces retreated westward, Soviet tanks rolled in, not as liberators but as occupiers. For these three small nations that had tasted independence between the world wars, 1944 marked not the end of occupation, but merely the exchange of one oppressor for another. What followed was one of the most remarkable, yet often overlooked resistance movements of the 20th century. Thousands of ordinary citizens, teachers, farmers, students, and soldiers took to the dense forests that blanket much of the Baltic landscape. There, they would wage a desperate guerrilla war against Soviet power that would last for over a decade. They became known as the Forest Brothers. These men and women didn't fight conventional battles with front lines and uniforms. They lived in underground bunkers, moved by night, and struck when least expected. Their story is one of extraordinary courage, brutal repression, and a fierce determination to preserve national identity against overwhelming odds. To understand the Forest Brothers, we must first understand what they were fighting for. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had all declared independence in 1918 following the collapse of the Russian Empire. For 2 decades, they built democratic societies and distinct national identities. This independence was violently interrupted in 1940 when the Soviet Union, empowered by the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, annexed all 3 Baltic states. The first Soviet occupation brought immediate terror, mass arrests, executions, and the deportation of tens of thousands to Siberia. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, many Balts initially saw the Germans as liberators. This illusion quickly dissolved as Nazi occupation proved equally brutal. By 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward, the Baltic peoples faced an impossible choice: flee to the west, submit to renewed Soviet control, or resist. The Forest Brothers movement began organically in late 1944 as Soviet forces reoccupied the Baltic states. Those who feared arrest, deportation, or execution, often former soldiers, nationalists, or anyone who had opposed the previous Soviet occupation, disappeared into the wilderness. Historian David Feast estimates that at their peak, approximately 30,000 partisans operated in Lithuania, 15,000 in Latvia, and 10,000 in Estonia. These weren't trained guerrilla fighters, but ordinary citizens who chose a life of hardship over submission. Alfonsas Sverinskas, a Lithuanian partisan who later became a priest, recalled, "We lived like animals in the forest, but we were free animals, not slaves." The Forest Brothers operated in small, highly mobile units of 5 of 15 fighters, though larger operations could involve 100 or more partisans. Their tactics were classic guerrilla warfare: ambush Soviet military transports, destroy infrastructure, eliminate collaborators, and quickly disappear back into the forest. Their underground bunkers were engineering marvels, often featuring ventilation systems, escape tunnels, and carefully concealed entrances. Some were so well hidden that modern archaeologists are still discovering them today. In Lithuania, the resistance was particularly well organized, with a formal command structure, uniform regulations, and even handwritten newspapers that kept isolated groups connected to the larger struggle. February 16, 1949 declaration united all Lithuanian partisan forces under a single command and explicitly reaffirmed Lithuania's commitment to independence and democracy. The Forest Brothers movement produced remarkable leaders whose stories embody the wider struggle. In Lithuania, Adolfas Ramanauskas Vanegas, a schoolteacher by profession, became one of the most effective partisan commanders. Under the codename Vanegas, a hawk, he led operations in southern Lithuania and eventually became the supreme commander of all Lithuanian resistance forces. Captured in 1956, he endured brutal torture before his execution in 1957. His memoir, discovered decades later, reveals his motivation: "When knew we would lose, but we had to show the world that Lithuania did not willingly join the Soviet Union. It was occupied by force." In Estonia, August Saba represents the unyielding spirit of the resistance. A former Estonian army officer, Sabi survived in the forests for an incredible 34 years. When KGB agents finally cornered him in 1978 at a riverside, the 69-year-old Sab, rather than face capture, dove into the river and drowned himself. Latvia's resistance produced introduced figures like Janis P. Nups, whose story borders on the mythical. After joining the partisans in 1944, P. Nups managed to avoid detection for nearly 50 years, living in a series of bunkers and hideouts. He only emerged after Latvia regained independence in 1991, becoming a living link to the partisan past. The Forest brothers couldn't have survived without civilian support networks. Local farmers risked everything to provide food, medicine, and intelligence. Entire communities sometimes participated in this dangerous aid, knowing that discovery meant deportation or death. Historian Martler writes, "The partisans represented the conscience of the nation. To help them was to affirm one's own humanity." Soviet authorities responded with ruthless efficiency. The NKVD, a later KGB, deployed special anti-partisan units that combined military firepower with sophisticated intelligence operations. They infiltrated partisan groups, turned captured fighters into informants, and masqueraded as resistance members to identify sympathizers. The human cost was staggering. Between 1944 and 1953, an estimated 300,000 Balts were deported to Siberia and Central Asia. Entire villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned to the ground. The Soviets understood that to defeat the Forest brothers, they had to isolate them from civilian support. By the early 1950s, the resistance was in decline. Stalin's death in 1953 brought a limited amnesty offer, which some exhausted partisans accepted. Others fought on, but their numbers dwindled year by year. The last organized resistance units were eliminated by the late 1950s, though isolated individuals continued to hide for decades. Lithuanian partisan Benediktas Mikulis emerged from hiding only in 1971, while Estonia's last known active Forest brother, August Sabi, remained at large until his death in 1978. Their defeat was inevitable. No guerrilla movement could indefinitely resist the full might of the Soviet security apparatus, yet in their apparent failure lay the seeds of future triumph. When Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania regained independence in 1991, the Forest brothers were immediately recognized as national heroes. Their struggle became a powerful symbol of Baltic resistance to Soviet occupation and a cornerstone of post-Soviet national identity. Today, museums across the Baltic states preserve their memory. The Estonian Special Forces conduct annual training exercises called Metsavened, a Forest brothers that draw on partisan tactics. Lithuania's Daugavos Vanagi monument honors the thousands who died fighting Soviet power. Military historians now study the Forest brothers as one of history's most resilient resistance movements. Their ability to maintain organized opposition for over a decade against overwhelming odds has few parallels in modern warfare. Perhaps most importantly, the Forest brothers preserved the idea of Baltic independence during the darkest years of Soviet occupation. By refusing to accept foreign rule as legitimate, they maintained a flame of sovereignty that would ultimately reignite in 1991. The story of the Forest brothers reminds us that resistance takes many forms. When conventional warfare is impossible, and when the opponent holds every military advantage, resistance can still persist through determination, local knowledge, and unwavering belief in a cause. For Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Forest brothers represent both tragedy and triumph: the tragedy of lives lost in what seemed a hopeless struggle, and the triumph of ultimately achieving the independence for which they fought. As Lithuanian President Dalia Grybauskaitė noted at a commemoration in 2018, they lost their battle, but they won our war. Without their sacrifice, we might have forgotten who we were as nations. They kept our identity alive when everything else was lost. In the end, the dense forests of the Baltic states harbored not just desperate fighters, but the very soul of three nations that refused to disappear from history.